Now researchers at the Canadian Medical Association Journal are shedding light on another possible risk. Their new study, just out this morning, suggests vaping may cause a unique type of lung damage. Their new alert is based on the case of an Ontario teenager who had to be put on life support after just several months of heavy vaping. Shannon Martin brings us the details this morning.
The 17-year-old boy from London, Ontario, was brought here earlier this year to the Lung Transplant Centre at Toronto General Hospital. Doctors say he was near death. The teen had been healthy, but he did admit he started vaping heavily 5 months earlier, every day inhaling a number of flavors, including green apple and cotton candy. He also vaped THC. To go from being healthy to becoming a candidate for double lung transplant in just a matter of months is something doctors say they've rarely seen before, if ever.
Initially it looks like just cough, then it looks like a pneumonia, then your child is on life support, then they're on a higher level of life support, and then they're talking about lung transplant.
The doctors showed us x-rays and CT scans of the boy's lungs. He had a condition similar to what's called popcorn lung.
These parts of the lung should be fully black, and they're not. They're full of these small little white dots, and they're very typical of airway inflammation and disease. This is very different from the presentations that have been described elsewhere.
The deputy editor for the Canadian Medical Association Journal says this boy's case and the type of lung damage he suffered due to vaping is a first in the world. The editor says it's just more evidence that stricter regulations are needed now on e-cigarettes.
We have to conclude at this time that no e-cigarette product or use of e-cigarettes can be considered safe. We have to push back against the industry's message. The evidence is strong and clear that we cannot think of e-cigarettes as safe, and we have to start treating them as potentially harmful, much the way we do tobacco products.
Fortunately, the boy did not require a lung transplant, and he's now back home, but doctors say he's far from normal. He still suffers shortness of breath. Shannon Martin, CBC News, Toronto.
Now, CBC News reached out to Health Canada for its response to the study published today, and the email we got back says the health agency will review the journal's findings carefully, that it continues to monitor vaping-related illnesses in Canada and the United States, that Health Canada held a series of consultations on vaping earlier this year and is considering a number of changes to curb youth vaping, like restrictions to advertising and flavors. It also says it welcomes action at the provincial and territorial levels to reduce young people's use of vaping products. Dr. Samir Gupta is with us this morning. He's a regular contributor on health issues to our program. He's a respirologist and associate professor in the Department of Medicine at the University of Toronto. And as we were saying off camera, how fortunate we are to have you, because this is your area of expertise. So let's talk about this case in a little bit more detail. This 17-year-old from London, a world first, we understand. How is his case? Well, tell us about his case and how it's different from the other cases we've been covering.
Okay, so initially the story sounds very much like this epidemic of what's being called EVALI, or e-cigarette or vaping product use associated lung injury. And that's something we've seen now, over 2,000 cases in the US and a handful of cases in Canada. That's what we've been talking about for a few weeks now. So he's a young man who's using vaping products, and he develops a very severe cough, ends up in the emergency room, gets some antibiotics. But 5 days later, he goes back to the emergency room. Now he's much more sick. His oxygen levels are low. And very quickly, his lungs start to fail, and he ends up on a ventilator. And this is where the story starts to diverge. So the previous cases that we know about in terms of lung injury have almost exclusively affected the lung tissue itself. Whereas what seems to have happened in this young man is that it affected what we call the airways, or those tubes that conduct the air towards the lung tissue. Okay. This is something we call bronchiolitis, with bronchial being for those bronchial tubes, and it's the first time we've seen this with e-cigarettes.
It mentions in Shannon's reporting that it was something similar to popcorn lung, and that's a term that we have heard before. We're going to look at some pretty horrifying slides here. I mean, what is that condition?
So I think this is an important part of the story, and it's a bit of a reminder of how we need to be better at learning from the past. So in the early 2000s, there was an outbreak of this otherwise rare condition called bronchiolitis, and it was being seen in people who were working in factories making microwave popcorn. And as it turns out, it was particularly those people who were exposed to these compounds used to create that buttery flavor in the popcorn.
Right.
And specifically people around these heated mixing vats where those compounds would make their way into the air and they were breathing them in. Ultimately, they figured out that this buttery flavoring compound called diacetyl was responsible for this injury or this bronchiolitis. So diacetyl is very good at giving that buttery flavor.
Which shows up in these slides. And
Right.
what do these slides actually show us about how it affects the lungs?
Yeah, so you're seeing these little dots in the lungs, and,
Yes.
and this is a sign of what we call bronchiolitis or inflammation of those small airways caused by that diacetyl.
All right.
And what really happened in those popcorn lung cases is that buttery flavor, which is completely safe to consume orally, we discovered was not safe to breathe in. And I think what's important in terms of the parallels there is, as you know, there are many different flavors for e-cigarettes.
Yes.
And we also know that many of those flavors actually use diacetyl.
So we already know that chemical is dangerous. Why then is it allowed to be in the flavoring for e-cigarettes?
Right. And this boils down to the main issue that as health professionals we have with e-cigarettes, and that has to do with regulation. So these companies are required to ensure that anything in those cartridges is safe to ingest, which means orally. So the premise there is that if something is safe for us to eat or drink, it must also be safe to heat up to over 200 degrees and breathe into our lungs. And that's just, it's common sense to realize that those just aren't the same things. Our gastrointestinal tract is designed to deal with all sorts of things that we might put into our mouth, but our lungs not so much.
So you get the clear call in the CMAJ editorial that accompanies this of the need for stricter regulation and focusing on these additives, these chemicals. What do you think?
I think that, as Canadians, we all expect that if something is going to be legally sold in our country, it has to be safe. Once you put something on the shelf, I think it creates a perception that whatever that is has been through some basic health regulatory and safety framework and that it won't cause harm. The problem is that those standards are really low for e-cigarettes. We have over 7,700 different flavors now. We have over 460 different brands. And the result of that is that we really don't know what's in these cartridges. The studies are showing that what's being found on analysis is often different than the ingredient list. And more importantly, we really don't know what the short and long-term consequences are of breathing those things into our lungs. So in some ways, we're kind of permitting what is, a natural experiment on our population. And that has consequences. For this young man, it nearly cost him his life.
Yes, and I mean, we heard quite strikingly Dr. Stanbrook, whom you know, in Shannon's reporting, saying, based on the science we have to this point, we should not consider anything associated with e-cigarette smoking, vaping, to be safe. It sounds like you'd concur.
Right, and I would just add to that and say, based on the lack of science we have to this point,
Right.
this is, for everything else, we have these standards of science and evidence and observation. We just don't have that with this product yet. We've allowed it to be out there, and people are suffering the consequences of that.